like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
All right, so are you ready for this? We're going deep on the American Constitution today. We're looking at excerpts from the American Constitution, a legacy of freedom and responsibility.
Oh, wow. That's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, this deep dive is going to be great. I think we're both going to learn a lot.
I think one of the things that always gets me about the Constitution, is that it wasn't created in some kind of like peaceful academic vacuum or anything. It was born out of conflict, like a hard-fought struggle for freedom.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that makes you realize just how high the stakes were, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like imagine having to create, a whole new system of government, like from scratch.
Yeah.
After just winning a revolution.
Right.
The founding fathers, they had a lot on their plate.
They did. They absolutely did. And they weren't just dealing with the practicalities of, okay, how do we set up a government? But they were wrestling with some pretty fundamental questions, about power and freedom and what it means to govern a diverse and sometimes very divided people.
Okay, so let's talk about those founding fathers for a second. We all know the names, right? Washington, Madison, Franklin, Hamilton. But were they all on the same page about how this new nation should be run?
Oh, not at all. I mean, you had delegates from 13 different colonies, each with their own distinct identities and priorities. So it wasn't just about coming up with a document. It was about forging a consensus. And that involved a lot of negotiation and compromise. Our source actually highlights how tense things got during the Constitutional Convention.
Oh, really? Give us a sense of that tension. Like, what were some of the major sticking points?
Okay, so imagine this. You've got smaller states, and they're worried about being overshadowed by the larger, more populous ones. You have these heated debates about how representation should work in Congress, whether to count enslaved people in the population, and how power should be divided between the federal government and the states. It's amazing they were able to agree on anything at all.
But they did. They did. And you know what they came up with? Wasn't just some temporary fix. I mean, this document has endured for centuries. Why do you think that is?
I think one of the reasons the Constitution has stood the test of time is because it's more than just like a list of rules. It outlines a set of principles that are designed to adapt and evolve. It's a framework for a government that could respond to changing circumstances, which is why people talk about the Constitution being this living document.
Okay, so let's unpack that idea of a living document. What does that actually mean in practical terms? How does a document written over 200 years ago remain relevant to our lives today?
Well, think about it this way. The Constitution sets up the basic structure of our government, like the three branches, the system of checks and balances, and the fundamental rights we enjoy as citizens. But the way those principles are interpreted and applied can change over time. They reflect evolving social norms and technological advancements and new challenges we face as a nation.
So the Constitution itself doesn't change, but our understanding of it can.
Exactly. Take the First Amendment, for example. It guarantees freedom of speech. But how do we apply that principle to something like social media, which didn't exist when the Constitution was written? That's where the debate gets really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it kind of brings up something that I think a lot of people wonder about. Do we still need the Constitution today? Isn't just a dusty old document that has nothing to do with our everyday lives?
That's a question that a lot of people have, and it's totally understandable. But the truth is the Constitution is more relevant now than ever. It's the foundation of our democracy. It defines our rights and freedoms, and it sets the rules of the game for our government.
So you're saying even though it was written centuries ago, it still has a direct impact on our lives?
Absolutely. Think about it. Every time you vote, every time you express an opinion online, or even just walk down the street knowing that you're protected from unreasonable searches, those are all rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But, our source also brings up something kind of worrying. It points out that a lot of Americans don't actually understand the Constitution very well.
Yeah.
How big of a problem is that?
Well, think about it this way. If you don't understand your rights, how can you defend them? If you don't know how our government is supposed to work, how can you hold your elected officials accountable? This lack of knowledge can actually be dangerous.
Can you give us a real-world example of what you mean?
Okay, we'll take the debate around free speech on social media. People throw around the First Amendment all the time, but often without really understanding its nuances. The Constitution doesn't give you the right to say anything you want, anywhere you want. There are limits. especially when it comes to inciting violence or hate speech.
So it's not just about knowing your rights. It's about understanding their limits and how they interact with the rights of others.
Exactly. It's about being informed citizens who can participate in these really complex debates in a responsible and constructive way. And that's something we're going to explore further in just a bit.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. This source keeps bringing up this link between freedom and responsibility. It's like they're two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other.
Yeah, that's such an important point. You know, the Founding Fathers knew that a society built on individual freedom, it wouldn't survive if people only focused on their own rights. There has to be this sense of shared responsibility, a commitment to the common good for a free society to really thrive.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit. What does responsibility look like in the context of the Constitution? What are some of our obligations as citizens?
Well, I think for starters, it means understanding that our rights have limits. You know, my freedom of speech, for example, doesn't give me the right to, like, shout fire in a crowded theater or to spread harmful lies that could incite violence.
Right. These that could infringe on the safety and well-being of others. It's about recognizing that our freedoms exist within a larger social fabric.
Exactly. Our rights are not absolute. They come with responsibilities. And those responsibilities often involve balancing our own interests with the needs of the community.
Yeah, the source also talks about the importance of informed political discourse. What does that look like in practice? It feels like that's something we're really struggling with these days.
It's definitely a challenge in our current climate. But I think informed political discourse, it starts with a willingness to engage with viewpoints that are different from our own. You know, it means being open to having our minds changed, being willing to consider evidence and arguments that challenge our assumptions.
It's easy to get stuck in our own echo chambers, especially online. But real discourse requires us to step outside those comfortable bubbles, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's about listening to understand, not just to respond. And it's about engaging in these debates with respect, even when we disagree strongly with the other side. You know, I think the Founding Fathers would be pretty disappointed with the level of vitriol and polarization in our current political climate.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of the Founding Fathers, let's go back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea of checks and balances. Can you explain a bit more about how that system works and why it's so crucial to our democracy?
Yeah, sure. So the idea behind checks and balances is to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. So you have the legislative branch, they make the laws, the executive branch enforces them, and the judicial branch interprets them. But each branch has the power to limit or check the actions of the others.
So it's this three-way tug of war, with each branch keeping the others in check.
That's a great analogy. It's a system designed to ensure that no one person or group can amass too much power, and it relies on each branch acting responsibly and respecting the limits of its own authority.
That sounds good in theory, but does it always work in practice?
That's a great question, and honestly, the answer is no, it doesn't always work perfectly. There have been times in our history when one branch has overstepped its bounds, or when the system has been gridlocked by partisan fighting.
Can you give us a specific example?
Yeah, sure. One example that comes to mind is the Watergate scandal in the 1970s. So President Nixon tried to use his executive power to cover up illegal activities. But the system of checks and balances ultimately held him accountable. You know, Congress investigated the scandal, the Supreme Court forced him to release incriminating tapes, and ultimately Nixon was forced to resign.
So even a president isn't above the law.
Exactly. The Watergate scandal is a reminder that no one is above the law, not even the most powerful person in the country.
Wow, that's a powerful illustration of how the system is supposed to work. But it sounds like it takes an engaged citizenry to keep the system functioning properly.
Absolutely. One of our key responsibilities as citizens is to hold our elected officials accountable. That means staying informed about the issues, participating in the political process, and speaking out when we see injustice or abuse of power.
You know, the source makes a point that freedom isn't free. It's something we have to actively protect and nurture. But with all the challenges we face today, it's easy to feel overwhelmed or powerless. What can one person really do to make a difference?
You know, it is easy to feel that way. But I think it's important to remember that change often starts at the local level. You know, you don't have to run for president to make a difference. Getting involved in your community, supporting causes you believe in, engaging in thoughtful conversations with your friends and family, those actions can have a ripple effect.
That's a really encouraging thought. It's about recognizing our own agency, our ability to create change in our own spheres of influence.
Exactly. And the Constitution provides the framework, the tools for us to do just that. It empowers us to participate in our democracy, to hold our leaders accountable, and to shape the future of our nation.
This conversation has really highlighted how crucial it is to understand the Constitution, not just as a historical document, but as a living, breathing set of principles that continue to guide us today. And that brings up another key point from the source, the importance of passing this knowledge and these values on to future generations.
Right. We have a responsibility to ensure that the freedoms we cherish today are still there for our children and grandchildren. We need to teach them about the Constitution, to instill in them a love for our country, and to empower them to be active, engaged citizens.
Yeah, because ultimately the future of our democracy depends on an informed and engaged citizenry, right?
Absolutely. And that's something we're going to talk more about in just a moment.
So we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the American Constitution. As we've been talking, I keep thinking about how this document is often seen as a symbol of unity. But it was actually created through this intense disagreement and compromise.
That's a great observation. The Constitution wasn't some, magical document that everyone agreed on right away. It was forged through debate and negotiation, and a willingness to find common ground even on some really, really tough issues.
Yeah. And that process of debate and compromise is something that's still relevant today, right?
Yeah.
We're constantly grappling with how to interpret the Constitution in light of new challenges and changing societal values.
Absolutely. Think about the ongoing debates about gun control, privacy rights, the balance between national security and civil liberties. These are all really complex issues with no easy answers, and they require us to engage with the Constitution in a really thoughtful and nuanced way.
Yeah, our source mentions that the Founding Fathers, brilliant as they were, they couldn't have foreseen all the challenges that we face today.
Yeah.
But they did create a framework that allows us to adapt and evolve as a society.
Exactly. The Constitution isn't like this set of rigid rules, carved in stone or anything. It's a living document. It's a set of principles that can be interpreted and applied in different ways, depending on the circumstances. And that's where our responsibility as citizens comes in.
So it's not enough to just passively accept the Constitution as it is. We have a role to play in shaping its meaning and ensuring it remains relevant to our lives.
Exactly. The Constitution is a conversation. It's this dialogue that's been going on for centuries. And each generation has this responsibility to add its voice to that conversation, to kind of push the boundaries of our understanding of freedom and justice.
Can you give us an example of how that's happened in the past? How have previous generations shaped the Constitution to meet the challenges of their times?
Okay, well, one of the most striking examples, I think, is the evolution of our understanding of equality. The original Constitution, as we know, allowed for slavery. But through amendments like the 13th, 14th, and 15th, as well as through, landmark Supreme Court decisions, we've gradually expanded the meaning of equality to encompass all citizens, regardless of race, gender, or other characteristics.
That's a powerful reminder that progress isn't always linear or immediate. It's often a long and winding road, paved with struggle and sacrifice. And it's a reminder that, we're still on that journey, that there are still injustices to address and rights to protect.
Absolutely. The work of perfecting our union is never truly finished. And it's up to each generation to kind of pick up the torch and carry it forward.
Okay, so we've talked about the history of the Constitution, the principles that it embodies, our responsibilities as citizens. But I think a lot of people are still wondering, what does this all mean for me? How does the Constitution actually impact my life?
That's a question I hear a lot, and it's a fair question. But I think the answer is all around us. Think about the freedoms we often take for granted. The freedom to speak our minds, to worship as we choose, to assemble peacefully, to criticize our government without fear of reprisal.
Those freedoms are pretty fundamental, right? They shape our society, our culture, even our sense of who we are as individuals.
Exactly. And they're all guaranteed by the Constitution. But they're not, self-executing. They require us to be active and engaged citizens, to understand our rights, to exercise them responsibly, and to defend them when they're threatened.
This source makes a strong case for why understanding the Constitution is so important. It's not just about knowing your rights. It's about understanding how our government works, how power is balanced, and how we as citizens can hold our leaders accountable.
Yeah, knowledge is power, and understanding the Constitution empowers us to participate fully in our democracy.
So for our listeners who are ready to take that next step, to delve deeper into the Constitution and what it means for their lives, what would you recommend?
I would say start by reading the Constitution itself. It's surprisingly short and accessible, and there are tons of great resources available online and in libraries to help you understand its complexities.
Right. And don't just read it passively. Engage with it. Ask questions. Discuss it with your friends and family.
Right.
Think about how its principles apply to the challenges we face today.
That's great advice. And remember, learning about the Constitution isn't just a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process of discovery and engagement.
All right, before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. This source ends with a really powerful question. What does we the people mean to you in today's world?
That's a profound question, and I think it's one that each of us has to answer for ourselves. But for me, it's a reminder that our democracy is a collective endeavor. It's not something that happens to us. It's something we create together.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. Knowledge is power. And understanding the Constitution empowers you to participate fully in shaping the future of your country.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and engaging.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for the freedoms that make this country great. Until next time, stay curious.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.